The Kentucky governor's race has tightened up in the past couple weeks. Polls showing a more close contest than was previously expected. Now Beshear and Cameron are essentially neck and neck in the polls. So of course in today's video we're going to talk about some of these new polls in the Kentucky governor's race, talk about the state of Kentucky as a whole, and then of course give some analysis ahead of the election on Tuesday. Now as a note, we will be releasing our final prediction on Kentucky, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Mississippi tomorrow. So of course, stay tuned for that. We're not going to make a final prediction in today's video, more so just analyzing the race as a whole. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So as this article from Louisville Public Media states, the race has gotten a lot closer since we last checked on it a few weeks ago. If we take a look at some of the polls overall, Emerson's not the only poll to show a close contest. Coefficient, which is another poll that released results at the end of October, had Andy Beshear just up by 2 points, and now we have an Emerson poll that essentially has the two candidates in a dead heat. Now, previous polling, the last time we talked about this race, had Beshear burying his opponent. You know, a lot of these polls had Beshear up high single digits, even low double digits, and that's pretty extraordinary given the fact that Kentucky is such a red state. Now, I will note, Kentucky is much more red when it comes to presidential and federal races rather than statewide contests. If we take a look at the politics of Kentucky as a whole, breaking it down by statewide offices, legislative control, Democrats, by and large, for most of the state's history, have had most of the power here, really since the formation of the Democratic Party in the mid-1800s. So, you know, going down through this era of Kentucky politics, you really only have small segments of time where Republicans have control of some of the statewide offices, but the legislature in Kentucky doesn't have a Republican majority until after the 2015 election. So you really have to go just less than a decade ago when Republicans first seized control of the Kentucky legislature in the state's entire history. So that's just a little bit of a backdrop. Kentucky is a very ancestrally Democratic state. This is a state that had been voting Democrat on the federal level more or less throughout the later half of the 19th century and throughout most of the 20th century. So Kentucky as a red state is a very new thing in terms of its history. And something very interesting about Kentucky, the state has never re-elected a Republican governor in its history. Matt Bevin almost became the first Republican governor elected, but he narrowly lost to Andy Beshear back in 2019. And of course, that's the circumstance to which we see ourselves today. Beshear ends up winning very narrowly over Matt Bevin, who was the most unpopular governor in the country at the time. He still barely lost. He only lost by 0.4%, a few thousand votes. And that's mostly because his support was completely eroded in the eastern part of the state. Beshear was able to run up very strong margins in Louisville and Lexington, already pretty Democratic portions of the state. But what drove Beshear home was the fact that you had so many Republican voters, particularly in the eastern part of the state, which went very strongly for Donald Trump back in 2016 and 2020. These are counties that Beshear in some cases won by safe margins. Elliott County, for instance, is a county often talked about. Beshear won this county by over 20 percentage points. Donald Trump in 2016 won Elliott County by 45 points. And in 2020, Donald Trump won Elliott County by almost 50. So a red trending county, a safe red county if there ever was one, and yet you have Andy Beshear winning this county outright. So Beshear was very popular in this portion of the state. Obviously, the southern portion of Kentucky is the reddest part of the state. It's always been that way historically, but the eastern part, coal country, has been very strong for Andy Beshear. And of course, if he's going to win on Tuesday, he's going to need to do significantly better than Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden have done in this portion of the state in order to win, because he can run up margins in Louisville and Lexington. But even if that's the case, if he's doing very poorly throughout the rest of the state, he's going to lose. Now, Beshear's not going to win the majority of counties on Tuesday. If he does win, it's really going to be strong margins in Louisville, Lexington, and really just chipping away at Republican majorities in the eastern part of the state and the southwestern portion of the state, because that's, of course, his roadmap to victory back in 2019. And again, he flipped a lot of counties from red to blue, and yet he barely won this election. That's because there's still a strong Republican base in Kentucky. Now, Matt Bevin was the most unpopular governor in the country at the time. Andy Beshear today hovers around a 60% approval rating, depending on the poll you look at. So Andy Beshear is incredibly popular. So it's possible he does even better than his 2019 margin, and that's what a lot of experts are saying ahead of Tuesday. Now, Daniel Cameron originally was not polling very well against Andy Beshear. He was down 9 points, 7 points, so on and so forth. So high single digits, low double digits. It's really only until you get till late October where this race actually starts to tighten up to the extent that it's now very competitive. Now, analysts have always known this race was pretty competitive just because Kentucky is a very red state, and a lot of these Republican governors who approve of Andy Beshear are probably going to come home on Election Day. The real question is how many of those voters actually will. Now, the interesting thing is Andy Beshear isn't even that much of a conservative Democrat. He's certainly to the right of Democrats nationwide, but overall he's running on a more or less standard Democratic playbook in a red state. He's running on economic issues, expanding healthcare access, improving education. And education's, of course, a big issue because one of the reasons why Matt Bevin lost back in 2019 was because he got the ire of the teachers union. And Matt Bevin had significantly cut funds to education. So that's one of the reasons why he was viewed so poorly by the majority of Kentucky voters. And yet, even with that poor approval rating, he still almost won. That's really thanks to incumbency, the Trump factor. A lot of these more rural Republican voters who were more open to voting for Democrats sort of became much more solid Republican voters in the era of Trump. Andy Beshear's father was elected back in 2007, not too long ago, less than 20 years ago, and he was able to win the majority of counties in the state, and not just counties in eastern Kentucky like his son, but also throughout the western portion of the state as well, doing well in both urban and rural parts of the state. In fact, his best county is a rural coal county known as Magoffin County. So, that goes to show you that the coalitions in the state of Kentucky, just like the rest of the country, have changed pretty profoundly over the past couple decades. And of course, in 2011, he went on to be reelected overwhelmingly, winning every single congressional district in the state. This part of the state right here, the southern portion, has always, like I mentioned, been very historically Republican. So it's really the only part of the state where he really didn't have strong support. But, part of the reason Andy Beshear won in 2019 was name recognition. Many Kentuckians know his father, Steve Beshear, liked his father as governor, sort of attributed that image to his son. But it also had to do with Matt Bevin's massive unpopularity. But this time around, it's a bit different because you don't have a very unpopular opponent. Now, Daniel Cameron obviously isn't as unpopular as Matt Bevin, but he's not as popular as Andy Beshear. And even though this is a red state where a lot of Republican voters are probably going to come home, there's a big portion of voters in the middle, voters that mostly voted for Donald Trump back in 2016 and 2020, who are going to vote for Andy Beshear because they think he's done a good job. Now, Andy Beshear is popular for a number of reasons. One of them being his response to natural disasters, which has been a huge issue in Kentucky. You had those tornadoes a couple of years ago. Andy Beshear was able to rise up to the moment. So it's things like that where you have citizens viewing their governors very favorably. And these races are a lot less partisan than other races, as we talked about. It's one of the reasons why New York governor's race last year was so competitive, even though the state is usually a D+20 state in the best of years for Republicans. So, Kentucky's in a very similar boat. This is a state that voted for Donald Trump by nearly 30 percentage points back in 2016 and voted for him by 26 points in 2020. So you did see a slight trend to the left, but overall, Kentucky is a very, very, very Republican state. You have the eastern portion of the state continuing to trend more Republican, and yet this is an area that Andy Beshear is going to need in order to win. Now, I will note that I think that Beshear will probably end up winning less counties in Kentucky than he did back in 2019. Again, this is more due to the fact that Matt Bevin was so unpopular, but I think what's going to make or break his performance is going to be Louisville and Fayette County. These areas, high turnout in these areas, high turnout in the exurbs, doing well in those counties. And of course, chipping away at Republicans' margins here, certainly doing 20, 30, 40 points better than Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. That's going to be essential for any Democratic victory in Kentucky. But, Daniel Cameron has struggled, I think, to campaign against Beshear. Again, mainly because Beshear doesn't really give Cameron a lot to run on. Cameron has been trying to run against Beshear as if he's a standard Democrat from a purple or even blue state, but Beshear is to the right of those candidates. He's not exactly anti-gun, so that attack line really doesn't work. And of course, when it comes to abortion, Daniel Cameron has the less popular position on abortion, and Andy Beshear has been ruthlessly exploiting that throughout the entirety of this race, saying that, Daniel Cameron is way too extreme on the issue, and Kentucky voters might eventually agree to that because there was an amendment pertaining to abortion back in 2022 that failed, which essentially stated that there was no right to an abortion in the state of Kentucky. That actually failed 52-47, so around 4.5 points. And this is the coalition I think is going to be very similar to Beshear's coalition if he wins. Incredibly strong margins in Louisville and Fayette counties, doing probably worse in the rural areas than he did in 2019 throughout the state, but doing slightly better in the urban and ex-urban parts of the state. So, of course, we'll really see how the results end up on Tuesday. Polls close in Kentucky, I believe it's 7 o'clock, might even be 6 o'clock, but it's very early. So by the time we start streaming, we'll probably have some early results out of Kentucky. Of course, again, if you haven't already, set a reminder to the live stream we're going to have on election night Tuesday, 7:30 Eastern. Link will be down in the description below. Leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.